Food chains show the flow of energy as one organism eats another in an ecosystem. They usually start with producers, which are things that make their own food through photosynthesis, which tend to be things that we call plants. The next level in a food chain is what we call primary consumers, and these are organisms that eat the producers. They are usually herbivores, and herbivores are things, right, that eat producers. The next level we call secondary consumers, and these are things that eat the primary consumers. Sometimes they only eat primary consumers, so they're carnivores, but sometimes they're omnivores that will eat the primary consumers and also eat producers. The next level is the tertiary consumers, and these eat secondary consumers. Again, sometimes tertiary consumers will eat primary consumers. Sometimes tertiary consumers are omnivores. In general, though, they tend to be carnivores and only eat other animals. The final level, occasionally within a very complex ecosystem, is that we can have quaternary consumers. These are top-level predators that eat other consumers, usually tertiary consumers, sometimes secondary consumers. These are very rarely going to be omnivores. The energy for all of these systems starts with the sun and flows up the food chain as one animal eats another. And so all of our energy from the sun converted by producers and then flows through the organisms to the top of the chain. The often overlooked link in the food chain is our friends, the decomposers. These are things like mushrooms, ants, worms, and they take the waste from, literally poop, or the dead matter from all of the other parts of the food chain and break it up into smaller bits to return to the soil for the plants to use to then put back together along with carbon dioxide and the energy from the sun to make the food chain function. So they're an incredibly important part to the cycling of matter that needs to happen as energy flows through the ecosystem. So let's take a look at a specific ecosystem of the Everglades and looking at how much does each animal eat. Gators typically eat 50 meals per year, about once a week. Birds, cranes, will eat about 200 fish a year. The carp that they eat eats about 10 pounds of plants a day, or 3,650 pounds of plants per year. So in order to keep one gator alive, it takes 50 cranes, which are going to eat about 10,000 fish, which then each of those fish, or all of the fish together, are going to eat 36.5 million pounds of plants to keep that one gator alive. So one top level predator takes a lot of things from those lower levels in order to be able to stay alive and function, which means that within an ecosystem, we have this thing called a trophic level pyramid, where we have to have lots of producers, like huge numbers of producers, compared to a smaller number of primary consumers, compared to an even smaller number of secondary consumers, compared to like a handful of tertiary consumers. And if a food chain were to have quaternary consumers, yes, it would be even fewer of those, because so much of the energy that an organism consumes, it takes to survive. So it's 90% of the energy is consumed by an organism to live, and then 10% of it is passed on to the next level, and 10% to the next level while 90% is used, and 10% to the next level while 90% is used. So because so much energy is used within the systems of each organism just surviving, there's not as much left for the next level to be able to eat and then use for itself. So it's much smaller amounts of organisms at higher levels than lower levels. But do gators really eat only cranes? Well, of course they don't. They eat all kinds of things. And so food chains help us to see how energy flows through a very specific link, but food webs allow us to see how energy flows within an entire ecosystem, because ecosystems are much more complex and most animals eat more than just one kind of food. Like in the Everglades, there's raccoons that eat fish and get eaten by gators. And then there's frogs that get eaten by the raccoons, and the frogs then will eat insects, and the insects eat the plants, and sometimes the insects eat the other insects. So if you went plant to insect to frog to raccoon to gator, the gator actually technically becomes a quaternary consumer of that particular system. You also have mice that live there that get eaten by snakes, and the snakes will eat the frogs, right? And the snakes will eat the fish, and sometimes snakes probably even eat raccoons. And the mice, right, then will eat some of the plants, and the mice will eat the insects and get eaten by the snakes. And then we have deer, and the deer are really big. So it's kind of weird that deer are primary consumers, because we tend to think of primary consumers as little. But the deer eat the plants. Deer will get eaten by gators. There's also panthers in the Everglades, and the panthers eat the deer, and the panthers will eat raccoons, and the panthers will eat fish, and the panthers will eat mice, and the gators will eat the panthers, right? So there's this whole interconnected web of all these different animals. We eat all of these different other animals, and these food webs show the connections and energy flow of multiple animals in the same ecosystem. The gator is considered the apex predator in this ecosystem because it eats almost everything below it, and nothing really eats it. So everything will usually wind up with an apex predator at the top. When we're looking at creating a food web for Mars, we need to consider which Earth organisms have the right traits suited to Mars, because it's very cold and it's pretty dry and there's not a lot of direct sunlight. And so we want to pick 5 types of producers, plants, that are going to deal with this, right? Because we need a lot of plants, probably thousands of actual plants, and we need a variety of food types of plants because not all animals are going to be interested in eating the same plant. So we've got to have a gigantic ecosystem with lots and lots of plants to be able to have enough matter and enough energy to push through to those other levels. We're going to look at taking 3 types of primary consumers. And these things, again, are going to need to be a variety, 3 different animals, enough to support the upper levels, but not so much that they're just going to completely mow through all of the lower levels. So enough to maintain production, feed the upper levels, but not overwhelm and eat all the plants. Secondary consumers, we're going to need 2 types. Maybe we'd want to look into having omnivores that could eat plants and animals at this level. And they're going to need to be the same requirements, enough to support the tertiary consumers. They're going to need to be able to maintain their reproduction, but not overwhelm the lower levels. Tertiary consumers, we're going to have 1 type. We're going to start with 1 and a very small number so that they have enough to reproduce, but not completely just eat everything below them. We're also going to want to have decomposers, at least 2 types of decomposers, so that they can focus on cycling all of that matter back so that the producers have enough atoms to work with to grow food. All of these animals do not need to be from the same ecosystem on Earth, but they're going to need to serve similar functions in each of those areas so that they will eat and get eaten and allow that matter to cycle through.